Hello, Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the signs and signals that you or a loved one is going to be unsafe to drive an automobile. Now, Alzheimer's being a progressive illness is going to have certain stages to it. Now, the easiest way of enumerating these is threefold. That is to say, early, middle, and late. Now, you can add on a few other categories like preclinical or mild cognitive impairment, so that it's a kind of a stage where before the Alzheimer's is actually severe enough to be detected, a person might still have subclinical Alzheimer's going on. But to just keep it simple, we're going to talk about early, middle, and late. And the real issue for driving safety is really going to be middle stage, and it's going to be in particular the transition between early stage and middle stage. So in early stage, a lot of the memory impairments and other things are going to be very mild, as the classification suggests. Mild or early Alzheimer's disease afflicted individuals might still be able to safely operate an automobile, but by the time they're in middle stage, the memory conditions deteriorate to the point where they become a hazard to themselves or to others. And the really upsetting fact about it is that one day they might be fine, so to speak, and the next day they might not be. And so it's one of those things where if they have a lapse while they're behind the wheel of the car, it could be an extraordinarily dangerous situation. Now, I did a video on some of the legalities that concern the question of driving. I have a fairly comprehensive introduction on Alzheimer'sProof.com to the legal requirements in the 50 states, and if you're a Canadian, I have also a guide similar to the various provinces in Canada. But in this video, I wanted to tackle the question of what are some of the early signs and symptoms that you might not be fit to drive an automobile anymore. Now, I'm going to break these down into about 5 different categories. I'm going to give you maybe 5 or 6. I'm going to give you a few for each of these categories. But in general terms, they're going to be sort of first person, second person, and third person. So in some cases, the afflicted person, him or herself, is going to be perspicuous enough. They're going to have the ability to kind of evaluate their own mindset, and they might realize that something's going on. In other cases, I'll call it second person. The caretaker, a family member, somebody close to the family is going to be the one to pick up on these things. And in the third party case, we'll deal with reports and other things that might be filed. And I won't really get in detail here, but we'll mention them. Reports and other indications that might occur from a person who doesn't have any personal dealings with you on an ongoing basis, like a relative or a caregiver. It could be a doctor, it could be a police officer, it could be just some random citizen, depending on the state. But in terms of the actual symptoms or signs, let's start talking about some of those. So the first one that I'll mention is going to be those that have to do with emotional changes. Now, these are some of the earliest ones that might be applicable. My dad, for example, who was always very mild-mannered, suddenly became aggressive and just very difficult, hostile, very difficult to deal with. Now, there can be any number of reasons for emotional or behavioral changes. They can include mood disorders and other kinds of neurological or other problems. But Alzheimer's can also result in mood changes and emotional changes if you notice yourself or your loved one having an inability to control anger, to control depression, to be so severely overcome by emotional fits or episodes that could jeopardize their ability to be objective behind the wheel, then it might be an early sign that something's going wrong with respect to their driving ability. The second category is going to be the more typical thing we think of when we think of Alzheimer's disease, and that's going to be memory problems. Many of these can be helpfully broken up into sort of a before, during, and after kind of classification. What I mean by that is before you get in the car, during the time you're in the car, and then after you leave the car. So thinking about that classification, before a person gets into the car, they might have trouble finding their keys. They might have trouble finding where they parked the car, remembering where they parked the car. Maybe they're in a parking lot at a mall or at a shopping center and they can't remember where they parked their car. Maybe they can't remember which car is theirs. In some cases, Alzheimer's afflicted individuals lose some of their shorter term memory and might go back. They might remember something further back a little more easily. There can be a number of mix-up along the lines of this. I know my dad tried to get into cars that weren't our car or weren't his car. He would routinely lose his keys. Now, everybody misplaces something from time to time, but what we're talking about here is a pathological memory deficit, something that is well beyond normal aging or normal forgetfulness. Think about memory deficits once a person's in the car. In the car, a person might forget which pedal is the accelerator, which pedal is the brake, right? Person might forget what a particular traffic sign indicates. I've seen pictures and news articles where memory impaired individuals might drive over construction sites. My dad, in fact, drove through a newly tarred road, much to the consternation of the construction and street workers who were dealing with it, because he just completely obliterated, or at least partially obliterated, what they had just constructed. You might forget what a traffic signal means. You might forget where you're going. You might forget how to get where you're going, even if it's a familiar route. And then after you sort of exit the automobile, you can forget how a particular dent or scrape or something happened to the vehicle itself. So all of these are going to be warning signs and sort of indicators that something is going on beyond, again, normal forgetfulness. Now, third classification is going to be those problems that have to do with motor skills and a reduction of motor skills. Once again, we can think of it before, during, and after kind of a classification. So before getting into the car, motor skills might impede a person's ability to open the car door, shut the car door, open the hatch. My dad, who had previously been handy enough to do things like change his own oil, might have trouble opening or shutting the hood of the car, at least shutting it appropriately. There was an occasion where he slammed the car hood and actually broke the hood prop because he had forgotten to lower it prior to shutting the hood. Once a person's in the car, then motor skills can affect their ability to turn the wheel, to make turns, to park the car, to handle the car correctly, to stay inside of the appropriate lane. They might even make it difficult, depending on the car, to control the pedals, to push the pedals, to do what is necessary physically in order to operate the car. And once again, these kinds of impairments are not specific necessarily to Alzheimer's disease. There can be normal age-related motor difficulties that arise, but Alzheimer's can either make those worse or they can bring them out in sort of unique and dangerous ways. Now, fourth category is going to be perceptual difficulties. And once again, the normal aging process might cause a person's visual abilities to decline. It might cause their hearing to decline and their other senses. But Alzheimer's can exacerbate that. That is to say, can make it worse. Person with visual problems might misjudge distances. You might find a person with visual problems getting spooked by shadows, not noticing cars that are in his or her peripheral vision, not noticing pedestrians, which is even scarier. They might have trouble seeing traffic lights or seeing turn signals, might have trouble following the brake light in front of them. They might have trouble hearing sirens, and again, some of these are going to dovetail. So maybe problems hearing sirens are going to be associated with problems forgetting what a siren signifies, maybe forgetting they need to pull over to the side of the road or get out of the way of an emergency vehicle. Number 5 is going to be affected reasoning abilities. Obviously, being behind the wheel of the car is going to include the judgment, is going to include the motor skills, it's going to include memory, but it's also, there is an element of reasoning involved. Now, many times when we're driving to a familiar place, we kind of go into an automatic pilot mode, really, and maybe you navigate there and don't even remember how you got there because it was just so ingrained in your muscle memory or whatever. But in many cases, a person's going to have to react, and possibly react in a situation that might matter for somebody's life or well-being. So for instance, if a car cuts a person off, or if a traffic accident stops the flow of traffic in one direction, it is possible that a person who is Alzheimer's afflicted, once they deviate from a normal known route, even if they do well with that, they might not be able to react. They might not be able to think through an alternative route or to help avail themselves of the kinds of resources they would need in order to get back home or to get to their destination if some kind of a deviation or detour becomes necessary. They might have trouble, once again, navigating around accidents or construction sites. Their reaction time is probably also going to be negatively impacted. They might have trouble on the fly, once again, kind of modifying directions. Every time you avail yourself of a GPS or a printed map or something like Google Maps or MapQuest, there are always those warnings on there that say, don't trust this information completely, double check it, make sure that there are no other changes, no road closures, no bridge closures. Well, a person who's cognitively impaired is going to be less able than a normal cognitively functioning individual to adapt to and change according to the situation, and that can lead to catastrophe. Now, many of these things that we've pointed out so far are either going to be, as I kind of said earlier, and maybe it's kind of a clumsy way of thinking about it, but they're either going to be first person, second person, in the sense that, not in the strict grammatical sense, but just in the sense of they're either going to be recognized by the cognitively impaired person, him or herself. Again, we're still talking about an early to middle stage Alzheimer's. By late stage, a person's going to be wheelchair bound, bedridden, immobile probably, or non-ambulatory in such a way that driving isn't even going to be a possibility. But early on, they might be able to detect some of these changes themselves, but more likely it's going to come from a family member, a friend, possibly a caretaker, somebody who knows them intimately and deals with them on a day-to-day basis. But there is also the possibility that some of these things might be brought to the attention of the family or to the afflicted person by a completely third party. Often that's going to be a law enforcement official. It might come in virtue of the fact that every time you're with your cognitively impacted dad or grandma, everybody's honking at her because she's in the wrong lane or he is taking too long to make a turn. He doesn't notice the light changes. It could be because all of a sudden grandpa is getting traffic citations or warnings. It could be because the neighbor comes up to you and says, you know what, last night your mom, pulled onto my grass by accident. And it might also be because a doctor has filed a report with your Department of Motor Vehicles. In a handful of states, doctors are required to do this. I actually get into this. I have a video on mandatory reporting states. There are 6 states like that. In the other states, doctors still are likely to report a patient who does have a manifest cognitive deficit, not only for ethical requirement and ethical reasons, but also possibly for other professional reasons. And this is not the place to get into that, but suffice it to say that there are a number of indicators that you or a loved one might not be fit to drive. This is a very sensitive topic, obviously, because driving is so fundamental to our sense of ourselves, to our freedom and independence. But at the same time, the person's behind the wheel of a 1-ton automobile. I remember, just as a kind of a poignant anecdote, my dad, in a last-ditch effort after I had to write a letter to his doctor, bringing his doctor up to speed on some of my dad's memory deficits. My dad made a phone call to the doctor and basically asked, could I just drive to the park? And the way he phrased it was, to the park to walk my little doggy. And obviously it pulls at the heartstrings to hear him say that. But when you think about it, even though the park is very close, and even though he's saying he's just going to drive there and come back, who else is in the park? Young kids, families. If his reaction time is decreased, he might, God forbid, not see a child or press the wrong pedal and accelerate instead of brake if somebody were to dash out in front of him. So the reality is that as hard as it is on the afflicted individual, the dangers almost certainly are going to outweigh, at some point, the dangers are going to outweigh the benefits to that person, unfortunately. Now, I can't make that determination for you, but I can simply say this is a serious issue, and as emotional as it can be, we as caretakers and others are going to have to try to be as objective as we can. So if something in this video was of help to you or of interest to you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for being with me today. I look forward to seeing you again in another video, and I wish you all the best and safe driving.